Uh, Madam Chair, Anna Young, Ambassador and Special Envoy of COP27, Wali Abdul distinguished panelists, members of the House, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning. It is indeed a great pleasure to be here at this famous Chatham House this morning and share thoughts on COP27 and Bangladesh's expectation. And I'm so glad to be back here because I was here when I was wearing a slightly different hat as a member of the private sector and shared my experience on labor-related issues good about 15 years ago. So it's an excellent opportunity for Bangladesh to speak about all-important climate change. And as I speak here today, Bangladesh is being hit by yet another cyclone, Sitrang, that has slammed our densely populated low-lying areas, and it has reached as far as capital Dhaka. And Dhaka was inundated, waist high water till last evening. I hope situation gets better today. While living at the edge of such catastrophic climate realities, Bangladesh, the fifth most climate vulnerable nation in the world, is referred to as the ground zero for climate vulnerability induced natural disasters. And may I just humbly remind the audience that even almost many of us here present today was born way back in 1970 in November. And since UN started keeping records of natural disasters, the worst natural disaster that has struck and affected a country or humanity in the history of mankind is called Bhola cyclone that swept through the coastal areas of Bangladesh way back in 1970, and nearly 1 million people perished in one evening. Despite our less than 0.47% contribution to global emissions with a carbon footprint of less than only 0.6 tons per capita against the global average of 4.5 tons. Every year, our country loses around 2% of our GDP to climate change-induced natural disasters. And by the turn of the century, we'd be losing 9%. And it's a country that grew almost at the rate of 7% every year for the last 10 years. So just imagine, without climate change, that extra 2% would have taken Bangladesh at a much higher position in global economic struggle, progress, or whatever, whichever way you want to look at it. And the Ukraine war and the economic downturn across the globe may easily divert our attention from climate change. And that's what's happening for the last couple of months, unfortunately, which still remains the undeniable reality and most serious global challenge for our planet and needs urgent and immediate global actions. According to Global Climate Vulnerability Index of 2021, while 1 out of 45 people globally would be climatically displaced by 2050, for Bangladesh, it would be 1 out of 7, as opposed to 1 out of 45 for the rest of the world. Around 6 million people in Bangladesh have already been internally displaced due to climate change-induced phenomena like sea level rise, increasing salinity, river erosion, droughts, and floods. By 2050, more than 17% of our coastlines, comprising 19 low-lying coastal districts, and all of them were affected in the last 48 hours, with about 25 million people may go underwater, according to IPCC report. Approximately 90 million of our population live in, as we call them, high climate exposure areas. On top of that, we are bearing the burden and the risk of temporarily hosting 1.1 million forcibly displaced Myanmar Rohingyas at the cost of environmental havoc in the coastal areas of Cox's Bazar that erased 8,000 acres of forest. Ladies and gentlemen, while battling with such profound climate survival challenges, Bangladesh, under the leadership of our visionary Prime Minister, Her Excellency Sheikh Hasina, has also emerged as a global leader in climate adaptation and resilience. At the COP26 in Glasgow, the BBC ranked Prime Minister Hasina as one of the top 5 deal breakers as the then president of the 56-member Climate Vulnerable Forum, widely known as CVF. At the COP26, in a CVF COP26 summit, with articulation of COP26 President Alok Sharma and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, the Bangladesh presidency adopted the CVF COP26 Dhaka-Glasgow Climate Declaration, reflecting the interest and expectation of the CVF at the COP26 and beyond, and called upon the COP26 presidency to adopt a climate emergency pact as part of the Glasgow Declaration that delivers a climate finance delivery plan and asks for raising ambition on emissions and adaptation finance at every single future COP, especially from major emitters, including the G20. And we all know that is a problem. At home, the Bangladesh Parliament was the first to adopt a resolution declaring climate change as a planetary emergency in 2019. Bangladesh was the first LDC to set up a fully financed $450 million climate change trust fund way back in 2009, believe it or not, coming back from the Copenhagen COP then. This fund is already supporting more than 800 adaptation and resilience projects in the coastal and vulnerable areas of Bangladesh. And my constituents, I'm a member of parliament, that sits right on a mighty river called Ganges. In our part, it's called Padma. Half of my constituent lives on the bank of the river Padma / Ganges, are a beneficiary of this climate trust fund. Our locally led adaptation measures, including nature-based solutions such as indigenous floating agriculture and salinity and drought resistance crop varieties, are now models, knowledge sharing for many low-lying climate vulnerable countries. Bangladesh is adopting the Mujib Climate Prosperity Plan. Mujib is a founding father of our nation, and we coincided this initiative with his birth centenary in 2020. Named after our father of the nation, as I said, to constantly pursue strategic low-carbon policy frameworks integrated into our national development plans, to set Bangladesh's climate trajectory from one of the vulnerability to resilience to prosperity. Do we have a choice? I mean, that's... Ladies and gentlemen, at the COP27, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina would continue to seek climate justice as a country under existential threat as a result of global emissions and sea level rise. Should also continue to remain the leading moral voice of the climate vulnerable nations as part of the CVF presidency troika, having handed over the baton of CVF presidency to Ghana last June. Like all CVF countries, Bangladesh also pursues the net zero target, and at COP26, Prime Minister Hasina pledged to have 40% of our energy from renewable sources by 2041. And it's a very steep target given the situation we are all in recent times. She also made a bold declaration of canceling 10 coal-based power plants worth $12 billion of foreign investment. As a developing country, that's also a very steep commitment. At the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, therefore, we expect definitive commitments instead of rhetoric from the global leaders. And we have a couple of suggestions very quickly. Firstly, the world must commit to delivering a net zero future by 2050 through the implementation of ambitious nationally determined contribution known as NDCs based on the principles of common but differential responsibilities. Secondly, given the uncertainties of pledged climate finance at Sharm el-Sheikh, we need clear indication from the larger and richer emitters as to how they would materialize their funding commitment to meet the $100 billion in line with the Paris Accord. I must caution that this promised amount is not adequate to meet the needs of the most climate vulnerables. Thirdly, Bangladesh also calls for ensuring transparency and accountability when it comes to defining climate finance. A significant portion of the International Climate Fund should flow through the multilateral process. Fourthly, we also expect that 50-50 distribution of climate finance between adaptation and mitigation will be resolved in upcoming COP. Fifth, further to the challenges of adaptation, we need to develop an additional financing mechanism to leverage funding from public and private sectors to support vulnerable countries affected by loss and damage. Sixth, the developed world must be forthcoming to transfer green and advanced technology to the developing countries. We want the African COP to be a leading example of international cooperation in terms of life-saving climate technology for protecting our people and planet as part of climate justice. And finally, Bangladesh believes that the growing climate-induced migration is only too real to be treated as an afterthought. It is unfair to burden the climate vulnerable nations who are least responsible for carbon emissions with climate migrants. We do not have adequate resources to include this broad number of migrants in our national adaptation strategies. At COP27, the international community must recognize this issue before it escalates into a regional and a global security issue. The plights of millions of displaced due to sea level rise, river erosion, and droughts must be placed at the center of the COP27 discourse. I look forward to a successful COP27, continue to press for our unmet demands with CVF's trademark moral force and reasoned argument. I call upon you to amplify the voice of the vulnerable communities in the upcoming COP27. I wish Egypt all success. I thank the Chatham House for organizing this very timely event just ahead of COP27, and I would love to take any question in respect of Bangladesh and ex-president of Climate Vulnerable Forum. I thank you all. Jai Bangla, Jai Bangla.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Chatham House for organizing this important event. And I'm pleased to once again join in one of your always substantive and helpful meetings. And it gives me the pleasure to speak on behalf of the incoming Egyptian presidency of COP27 to share some general remarks and engage with you on the issues of the matter that we're looking forward to addressing and tackling successfully at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in a few days, essentially. As you may have heard, the COP27 presidency repeatedly insists this should be the implementation COP. Everyone realizes that we've spent a lot of time, important efforts have been put in place to complete the Paris Agreement and the Paris Agreement work program culminating in Glasgow when we finally reached a relative agreement on Article 6, which was, so to speak, one of the last pieces of the puzzle that allows us to move forward on the full and complete and ambitious implementation of the Paris Agreement provisions. First and foremost amongst them, of course, being the NDCs, and that's why there's always going to be a push for countries to update their NDCs. Many countries, I'm pleased to share with you, have already done that. Egypt has done that, but every other day we're hearing another country that has either updated their NDCs or intends to do so in Sharm el-Sheikh. So the full implementation of the Paris Agreement has to be at the core of our work, but in parallel to that, the expectation and the needs and what science effectively tells us in terms of significant gaps when it comes to mitigation action, adaptation action, provision of finance, that necessitates that we also complement the negotiating intergovernmental track with the non-governmental, all-stakeholder type of action agenda. To that end, we're translating this motto of implementation COP into a reality through a broad array of initiatives that are being launched, many of them coming from the Egyptian presidency, but others coming from other partners around the world. And in addition to that, we will have a set of thematic days that will be addressing in depth many of the issues on the table that you would expect to be their finance, energy, gender, youth and civil society, biodiversity, agriculture and adaptation. And the list goes on, 11 or 12 thematic days dedicated to all of these issues. They're not just sessions for discussion, but many of them we anticipate and expect will witness the launch of many initiatives that will be beneficial to communities around the world. So implementation is our main objective, and it's not something that we had difficulty in reaching it as a motto, but rather this is the demand, the expectation, not only of governments, but of communities and societies around the world. We are all cognizant of the realities of the world that we live in. We realize that science tells us that the climate challenge is there, is real, and is not going to wait for anyone, and that there will be no added time to this challenge. So we need to move urgently, but we're also aware that the world is witnessing at this time multiple other challenges not directly related to climate change. First and foremost, the economic situation coming out of the COVID economic challenges and the slow growth in many countries and threats of even recession in others. So this is a reality that we're all very aware of. Linked to it somewhat are the consequences and the impacts of the war in the Ukraine, the general geopolitical situation, another challenge that exists before us, and several others that impact international collaboration, multilateral diplomacy. However, we see this as an opportunity, COP27, as a serious opportunity for everyone to coalesce, to come together on perhaps the most serious existential threat of our generation, around which there is perhaps the widest unanimity in acknowledging its urgency and need for action. So this might be, and we aspire for it to be, an opportunity for adversaries elsewhere to come together on an issue that no one disagrees requires immediate, impactful action. So we are looking at it, despite the challenges, as an opportunity to rise above the various global challenges that we're confronting and come together and move forward, because no one challenges the need for this action at this time. Egypt, as host of this COP, we think that we are uniquely positioned to serve as a bridge between adversaries. We have a tradition of multilateral diplomacy, facilitation, and we take this seriously. And we think, as incoming COP president, while it is a multilateral process and while it is dependent highly on agreement and consensus among the 190 plus parties to the agreement, we still think that we are in a position as a developing country, as an African nation, who is very well versed in the priorities and very knowledgeable of the challenges of developing countries, but at the same time has excellent outreach and relations and communication and understanding of the perspectives of developed countries to play the role as bridging these gaps. Again, COP presidencies facilitate, mediate, create the conditions conducive for agreement, but it's up to the parties ultimately to come together and find the common ground in order for us to move forward on the variety of issues. I won't get into the details of the negotiations. Those are, of course, very familiar to all of you. We have the mitigation work program. We have the global goal on adaptation. We have the loss and damage issue, which is of much importance and needs to be pushed forward. And we have the cross-cutting issue of climate finance that must be addressed efficiently to achieve climate justice. And here I would be failing in my duty if I did not communicate the sense that the process is, to a large extent, ignoring the grand bargain upon which it was created. The grand bargain, going back in history, but even as recently as 2009 in Copenhagen, where the $100 billion commitment was made, and where after that, the Green Climate Fund was created as a manifestation of this grand bargain, that those who benefited for decades and centuries, indeed, from fossil fuels and built wealth had an obligation to assist countries who were, on the one hand, least contributors, and on the other, the most vulnerable and most affected by the negative impacts, to assist them in making the requisite contribution to this global effort. So there is a grand bargain underlying all of our work. And I think that many countries, especially in the global South, insist, rightly so, on the differentiation and responsibilities and on the accommodation in providing them with necessary means of implementation. First and foremost, of course, finance, but in addition, technology and capacity building. With that in mind, and based on that understanding, the expectation is that the commitments to provide finance must be met, and they have not been met. And while this may not be directly on the agenda, we have two main finance agenda items, being the definition of climate finance, which is a very fundamental point, and the other one is the new collective quantified goal. These are mandates that start here in Sharm el-Sheikh, but extend to future COPs. So I'm just highlighting the importance of finance and support. It is a catalyst in the sense that, on the one hand, it provides the necessary means to implement, but it also has a very important political meaning in the sense that it shows trust and confidence and gives the assurance to developing countries that while they will be asked to make a contribution and to show more ambition, that the means for them to do that will be made available, and that they will not have to do it at the expense of their legitimate sustainable development objectives and the legitimate pursuit of eliminating poverty in their societies. So in general, we're going to attempt as incoming presidency to ensure that progress is made across the board. People have asked us over this past year, what are your priorities? And I don't think any COP presidency at this time has the luxury of prioritizing. We cannot prioritize. Every issue witnesses a gap, and every issue warrants filling that gap and bridging that gap, be it on mitigation, adaptation, finance, and of course, loss and damage, as I mentioned earlier. We have been working hard behind the scenes and sometimes in front of the scenes, on the scene, to push these agenda items forward, to ensure that progress is made on all of them, and to ensure that equity and differentiation are maintained throughout the process. It is a difficult time, and we have multiple challenges, but I'd like to conclude always by reminding everyone that despite these challenges, we have made progress. Number one, there's much more awareness across the board in every country in the world of the seriousness of the challenge, but also of the opportunities that exist in moving forward on many of these issues. Prices of renewable energy have dropped dramatically. Civil society organizations are much more knowledgeable and are putting pressure on governments, on private business to get their act together, to move at a pace that was unprecedented in the past. And I could go on and on multiple areas that give us a lot of hope. The realization by the private sector that they have a role to play is tremendous. There is potential there to bring in literally trillions of dollars that will alleviate the burdens from developing countries, but also from developed countries who have an expectation to deliver finance. Philanthropies are coming on board in an unprecedented manner, and we're bringing all of these players together across the board on all issues in Sharm el-Sheikh. So lastly, I just want to conclude that for anyone looking at outcomes, we are very cognizant of the importance of the balance between what has now become known as the inside-outside dynamic. You have the multilateral governmental process, which will continue to be the essence of conference of party meetings. But on the other hand, there are roles for stakeholders across the board again, from every sector of the industry, from multilateral development banks, from philanthropies, as I mentioned, from civil society organizations, from the science community, cities, municipalities. There is a role, and we are very keen on ensuring that this contribution takes place, that is effective and meaningful and not just a token representation. That's why in articulating all of our initiatives and all of our thematic days, and indeed on the presidential roundtables, we have made sure that they are not ever exclusively governmental. The only exclusively governmental realm might continue to be the one where legal obligations are negotiated in the negotiating tracks, but anything bar those will include all stakeholders, because we cannot meaningfully say it is an implementation COP without involving those who will be called upon to implement, to adjust, to shift direction, to move towards sustainability. So we are looking forward, of course, to welcoming you all to what we hope will be an enjoyable opportunity and an enjoyable COP, but one that really helps the world move forward, make progress based on understanding. And I cannot conclude without saying empathy is everything. As long as we put ourselves in the shoes or the seat of the other interlocutor, we will be in a better position to understand their compulsions, their challenges, their priorities, and their concerns. That will take us a long way. We don't think that we can afford to continue on an adversarial path or a zero-sum kind of path. We have to have a win-win situation. That win-win situation exists. We as incoming presidency are going to show the way for others, and we look forward to them rising to the occasion and making sure that we do find the convergence that allows us to move forward on every aspect of the global climate agenda. So thank you very much, and it's indeed a pleasure to be here with you today. Back to you.
Ambassador. So I'll hand over to Professor Tim Benton.
Thank you very much, Anna. Good morning, everybody. I think the events in 2022 this year have illustrated or brought very firmly to mind three things for me. One is the palpability of climate change and the impacts of climate change, whether it's heat waves or floods or whatever, that have really made it feel real. And we live in the global north here in a non-vulnerable situation. And I really felt the kind of the empathy that the ambassador was talking about when the minister was speaking about Bangladesh. The second thing that 2022 illustrates to me is the fragility of our global systems. What we've had is an interaction between the geopolitics, the invasion of Ukraine, and its impacts on food and energy, coupled with coming out of COVID, which itself was probably made more likely by climate change and land use change, interacting with extreme weather. And all of those three things together have created a global cost of living crisis, a global energy crisis, and particularly, from my perspective, a global food crisis. And because our systems are so vulnerable to shocks and the interaction between one shock and another shock and another shock, as this year has changed, and as we look ahead, all I can see is an expectation that these shocks will just keep on coming at us in different ways, working their way through the system so that we're living in a kind of period of global crisis constantly. And if you think back, 2010, 11 in Ukraine and Western Russia, heat wave, food price spike, markets panic, food export bans like we've had this year, food go up, civil unrest in various places around the world, perhaps played a role in the Arab Spring, people movement crisis into Europe, a whole range of things that have eventuated. 2022, very similar, as I was explaining. And as we look ahead, we will be spending a lot of time responding to these crises. The third thing that comes out of 2022 is that the geopolitical tensions are making the world more likely to fragment, and the international architecture of cooperation that I have lived with throughout my lifetime, and we all have in some way, shape, or form, is really under stress. And depending on how the war in Ukraine escalates or ends, you can see a potential for a real global fragmentation and moving very firmly on the trajectory we've been on for the last 5-10 years, away from cooperation, which is what we need, into more conflict and contestation. And if you think about the world fragmenting, deglobalizing, trading preferentially with allies rather than on global markets, we are probably entering an era where prices will stay high for a very long time. I can't see a way in my specialist area of climate food interactions where we can look ahead and say, we'll go back to a world where food is really cheap. So if we're in a cost of living crisis this year, is it going to be a cost of living crisis in 5 years' time, 10 years' time? If the world is becoming more fragmented, how are we going to deal with these issues from climate change? So in my kind of community of kind of climate change researchers and interacting a lot with civil society, there's a real sense of need and urgency. We know that the scale of impacts from climate change are increasing. We know our ability to adapt to extremes is really threatened. The speed with which extreme weather is changing means that we're already hitting limits to adaptation in some ways, in terms of whether it's urban drainage or sea level rise or other things. We know mitigation is lagging behind what is necessary. So, as I mentioned earlier, there is a potential that we live in a world of so much crisis that we're always recovering or rebuilding, and we take our eye off the ball and we can't put the money that's necessary into the adaptation and mitigation agenda because we're always dealing with the crisis. And I think that's one of the test cases for Sharm is going to be, what is the political economic room for the global north to invest in the global south, whether it's in climate finance in general or loss and damage, if everybody's saying we don't have any money, we have to concentrate on our own, and how much will that undermine the progress that is necessary? Final point, I think the events in 2022 really highlight the need to transform our societies as quickly as possible. And what I've seen post-Ukraine invasion is that for many countries, they have really focused on the supply side. How can we maintain our energy supply? How can we maintain our food supply? And certainly in the energy area, the UK government has been woeful in not saying, how can we insulate houses? How can we speed up the transition? But instead has been talking about new licenses to extract fossil fuels from the North Sea. And similarly, in my area in food, if in the European Union, EU 27 plus UK, if we had chosen to change our diets and eat 15% less chicken and pork, that would have freed up the same amount of grain for human consumption as was trapped in Ukraine. And we could have averted the global food crisis by a relatively small shift in European diets, but no one talked about that. The demand side has been off the agenda for too long, and we need to think about not just how can we innovate in supply, but how can we innovate in demand and allow us to live within the planetary boundaries. So finally, my hope for COP27, echoing what the ambassador said, is for the parties to deliver increasing ambition, not to backtrack, not to hide behind the cost of living crisis, not to run away from the need to really push forward and implement the transformations that are needed. We need sustainable food systems. We need sustainable energy systems. We need to commit more to climate finance, and particularly to loss and damage. And Anna will talk about that. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Tim. Anna, please.
Thanks, and good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here and an honor to be speaking next to such esteemed guests. As the ambassador and the honorable minister have already mentioned, this issue of loss and damage finance is expected to be a headline issue at COP27. And what I thought I would do is to dig a bit deeper into the politics around this issue coming from a non-government perspective, focusing on what different countries want and what some of the main challenges are in this space. And this is largely based on research that a colleague and I have been doing over the last few months. Just so that we're all on the same page, when I'm speaking about loss and damage, I am talking about the economic and the non-economic harms caused by climate change impacts that cannot be or have not been avoided through adaptation or mitigation. So firstly, I think it's worth mentioning that the issue of loss and damage finance has really risen in political salience in recent years, not least after COP26. For many climate vulnerable nations, it has long been a key priority or a life or death issue. But now we're also seeing developed countries engaging on this topic in a way that we haven't really seen before. I am not saying things are moving fast enough, but they are moving. Just a few weeks ago, we saw Denmark coming forward, pledging dedicated loss and damage finance, becoming the first UN member state to do so. The G7 are talking about loss and damage, and they are expected to launch a new initiative on financial protection to support those affected by loss and damage, together with the V20 group of finance ministers at COP27. It's also looking increasingly likely, it is looking likely that there will be a specific agenda item at COP27 to discuss loss and damage finance. So progress is being made. But what are some of the challenges then? Well, in the past, developed countries have feared that providing loss and damage finance may open them up to, they may become legally liable to provide vast amounts of financial compensation for loss and damage. Since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, this conversation has in many ways moved on. For some developed countries, there no longer appears to be this direct link between loss and damage finance on the one hand and liability and compensation on the other hand. And I think it was interesting to note how the Danish Minister for Development Cooperation kind of framed his remarks when he announced the Danish loss and damage pledge. He was kind of specifically saying that it was not a matter of compensation, but about addressing this very real and urgent issue. However, I do think it's clear that these issues of liability and compensation, they do continue to make some developed countries apprehensive. This is not the only factor that is preventing them from taking a more ambitious stance on loss and damage finance, but it is one of them still. The second challenge is that there are simply different views about what should be done. At COP26, we saw the G77 and China come forward with a proposal to establish a dedicated loss and damage finance facility. This did not receive sufficient support among developed countries, but this called for the facility continue. Some developing countries are calling for there to be a decision at COP27 to establish this facility, and that parties then afterwards work out the details around how it, where it would be placed, what type of activities it would support, how it would be resourced. I think it is quite unlikely that a decision like that will be made at COP27. At present, developed countries indicate that they do not really see how a facility would add value vis-a-vis the organizations that already exist. And instead, they say it would be more effective to work through the climate funds and the other type of organizations out there. And there are also some developing countries actually which see a risk in having this type of agreement before having worked out the details how a facility would function. I think what we could see at COP27 is more agreement on what the process looks like going forward. There could perhaps be a call for other institutions like the multilateral development banks to enhance finance and in this space and do more on loss and damage. The negotiations will also continue, of course, on the Santiago Network, which is a body that is meant to connect governments in developing countries with providers of technical assistance on loss and damage finance. And maybe we'll see more developed countries step up and provide a dedicated finance for loss and damage. I've already mentioned also this initiative, the Global Shield on financial protection. So like in sum, I don't think we can expect COP27, of course, to solve the loss and damage challenge, but I do think it's really important that progress is made and that trust starts to be reestablished between countries so that we can really move this issue forward in the next few years. I won't take up too much of your time because we also need time for Q&A, but I think I'll just quickly mention two other challenges. One is the challenge of reaching scale. As we've heard, developed countries have not yet managed to mobilize the $100 billion per year in adaptation and mitigation finance, which were promised in 2009. And loss and damage is supposed to be new and additional to that. There are big challenges in many wealthier nations today when it comes to getting climate finance in general approved in national parliaments. So I do think we need to think quite creatively how to mobilize finance for loss and damage from a range of sources, also feeding into these larger discussions that are going on about how to reform the international financial system. Finally, I think there is a bit of a challenge when it comes to definitions. Sometimes there seems to not be a shared understanding among countries about what loss and damage is. Countries sometimes appear to be talking about different things, and many developed countries say it is difficult to distinguish loss and damage finance from adaptation finance, some types of humanitarian assistance and development aid. One way of getting through that would be to agree on a definition, but it might be quite difficult for countries to agree on that. But I think in the short term, what could be done is perhaps to share more case studies of what you're doing in Bangladesh, for instance, when it comes to addressing loss and damage, to make it clear to other countries what the needs are and what type of support it is that you need. I also think it would be productive to separate the conversations on addressing loss and damage from those around averting and minimizing it, because sometimes the discussions become very broad when we talk about essentially all aspects of climate change at the same time. There's a lot more I can say, but I'll stop there for now. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. So we have a little bit less than 20 minutes. We have questions from the participants who are online, but I'm going to start with the room. Gentlemen, okay, I have two questions here. Should we start here? Your name, organization, and your question, please.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. First of all, thank you to Chatham House and Bangladesh High Commission for organizing such a wonderful talk. My name is Chaudhry Rahman. I'm a practicing barrister from 12 Boulder Square. My question will be to Honorable Bangladesh Minister. He given quite a good insight about Bangladesh, but Bangladesh issues is not only Bangladesh, it's globally interlinked. The place I was born in Bangladesh is close to much talked Podda Bridge. And there is another river called Arialka. And that area actually, since I was a child, I have been seeing that the people actually losing their lives because of the river erosion. But because of the Podda Bridge development, the Podda Bridge area and the Arialka area now, because river management is bit improved now. But my question is, because Bangladesh is a river-prone country, nearly 54 river, and most of the area people are losing their enter village even sometimes. So my question will be that the fund allocated to this loss and damage fund is not enough, that the ministers, the speech, I sense it. So whether the rich country is coming forward and what is your agenda to push forward for further funds? And another point, because when the river erosion happening, the enter village, this is equivalent to the right to life, because the European Convention on Human Rights is, but when losing a livelihood, their village and homes, everything, their hopes and future, everything is destroyed. So in terms of future legal mechanism, my question whether this COP27 will be pressing for a legal future right as a, for existence, like similar to right to life. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Shall we take a couple before gentleman here?
Murad Qureshi, I'm a member of Chatham House. Can I address my question to the Minister? Firstly, the Minister, I do agree. I think the cyclone in November 1970 was very significant. It was only a month before the general election, which subsequently led to the liberation of Bangladesh. And I think the lack of response by the Pakistani authorities was a key factor in that election result, without any doubts at all. So it does affect the body politics when we have events like cyclones as at the moment in Dhaka. But coming to today, I'm glad loss and damage has been mentioned. I think that was one of the key things that we made some progress up at Glasgow. And if Salim al-Haq was here, I'm hoping he's not, because I'm hoping I'm asking the question he would ask. What are your expectations on that front? You mentioned that in your list of 5 key goals, particularly when we have John Kerry passing through Chatham House this Thursday. I'd like to know, Minister, what you would like to see from the climate change envoy for Biden, President Biden, to be saying to the world on that front, and an acknowledgement of the historical carbon debt which is owed to the developing world.
Thank you. We have actually 2 more questions. I'll just group them to Minister. There's one online around refugee vulnerability. So what is being done to address the vulnerability of Rohingya refugees in climate change in terms of building resilience? And the other one's around climate finance. So where is Bangladeshi government working to form regulatory policies to strengthen the financial systems, financial industry in line with the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is the GFANZ guideline. So we have questions on the legal framework, more funds for loss and damage, refugee vulnerability, and regulatory policy for climate finance.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course, the very objective that we're trying to pursue is to include loss and damage in the agenda. That's the first thing. And it's likely, it's not just an optimism. We, during different sidelines, during the high-level week at UNGA, I had several rounds of discussion, brainstorming, closed-door discussion in presence of key countries, ministers, and they're trying to get a sense of the urgency and how serious the countries were in the global south or at the receiving end of it. And I think we have made a decent case. Anna just mentioned about Denmark came forward, and it's a very welcoming move. We express our gratitude, and we are trying to leverage on that. That needs to be replicated. I think if you consider the different multilateral groupings. G77 already agreed. We probably need European Union convincing, and there are multiple other countries. Since those meetings were closed door, I'm not going to make it public, but we have shared that with our, let's say, American friends. I met my counterpart last week and conveyed that message. And prior COP26, Senator Kerry went to Bangladesh, and we made our case absolutely clear. And individuals like Salimul Haq spoke, and I think he got a good sense of it. But we knew at that point of time, how to put it politely, they're not in a very, in a listening mode, let's say, on loss and damage. But a year or two on, I mean, things are changing, albeit a lot less, but progress. I think countries like Denmark, and if we can get a couple of other countries convinced in Europe, because Europe literally champion. Let's not forget that we have actually, in a way, wasted 5 years because the major member country pulled out from their commitment. So that obviously didn't help. And we talk about perpetuity and continuity and responsibility of the government, no matter who was in charge, when, and all that. I think they should rise, to this occasion and try and catch up with the losses that was made. So the expectation is absolutely clear to include, loss and damage. We do have a decent regulatory framework, but I attended the GCF meeting, a sideline event in Glasgow last year. The disbursement of whatever 80 billion or they raised in 13 years, the pace of disbursement is rather slow and complicated. The climate vulnerable countries do not necessarily have huge capacity. Some of the countries do not know how to apply and access that fund. That's another issue. We're not here to talk about the detail, but our friend in Cairo is listening, and I'm sure there will be events and talks about it, how to make it easier for countries. We do have a decent capacity, as you know, that we have played a lead role, and we have our own funding mechanism of how that $450 million that we created good 12 years ago. But there are, of course, countries who cannot simply apply, period, and that's why the rate of disbursement is really slow. So that's that. And on the refugee front, I mean, probably he meant the impact that we have, let's say, just prior to this cyclone, our local resources were used, and when such cyclone hits, and you try and take a preparation in 48 hours or 72 hours, you do not necessarily check how much funding is available. You just go for it, and then you realize that you have actually used the fund that was meant to be used somewhere else. And Rohingya funding, we have a mechanism called JRP, Joint Response Plan, and we are into our 6th year, but 5 JRPs, and every year we see size shrinking, and the commitments are not getting fulfilled. We have a budgetary requirement of $881 million this year, and I think collectively they have raised only about 52% of it. And let's say even if we spend 2% for cyclone preparation, then flooding, then landslide, and during the monsoon, they are in a kind of a hilly area, so it's going to impact their food and health situation eventually.
Thank you, Minister. Another round. I have a lady here in front.
Good morning and thank you. My name is Shanaz Ahmed. I'm head of school of a very large primary school in the Royal Borough of Greenwich, an outstanding school. Now, the stakeholders talked, you talked about stakeholders involving all stakeholders. Now, within school, we always talk about our children, raising the voice of pupils, enabling them to talk. Now, they're the next generation. How, and this question is to the panel, how do you hope to involve our next generation, our children, for the future?
I'd like to answer that.
Okay, yeah, of course, please.
It's very interesting. Just imagine the students that you were teaching, if you were a teacher 13 years ago, they were in primary, grade 5, they would have been in university today. And if you educated them on the impact that countries like Bangladesh or Vanuatu suffered, I'm sure they will be in favor of what we are talking. We have we have included climate change issues and environment in our textbook in schools. I'm not too sure here, but even if it is here, are we actually do have a policy or a system where you are getting through, you're making them understand, and are they truly friendly towards all this discussion or not? And I think that's a huge issue that we need these country of large emitters to make it mandatory in their school curriculum. So at least if we cannot achieve much today, that generation 10 years on, 12 years on can make a positive contribution.
Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you.
And I'll take the questions online. Thank you, Minister.
Yeah, this is a question to all of you. The military use of the fossil fuel, and actually they are the most emitters in most of the big militaries, and probably you can shed on some light that from Kyoto there was some military exemption not to report it. Probably in Paris the exemption is not there, but the military, if they voluntarily share the report, and probably still it is not the part of the UN report on the climate change. So especially in the context of the war, and in the context of this Russia and Ukraine war, and we know this will be accelerated in the coming years. So how can you think that we can reduce the overall, and still it's a question not to reduce, to get the report of their users, the data.
Yeah.
So this is one, and the second is generally, and also for all of you, just for your probably to make your concluding remarks, that the loss and damage and the issue of this climate finance and others, we are too much, whether we are concentrating on these issues, or should we rather change our focus on the extractive uses of the resources and the whole mode of production itself, and the investment pattern itself, not necessarily the climate investment or climate fund, but overall the global high level of high-handed development interventions. Those are still creating people, dragging people from the safety to the risk. So the pattern of the investment, the pattern of the overall production processes, and one of you mentioned the whole pattern of the lifestyle, and also our living styles, whether we need to change that. So the investment and the changes of the lifestyle, and at the same time, the political globalization, which are missing actually. We have many processes of the economic globalization, cultural globalization, media is actually doing their own part, but political globalization, we don't have that much of convening ability. So whether we focus much more on these type of issues, like the changes of the whole overall, the mode of production itself, and sometimes it is termed as a Marxist terms, but actually the extractive forms of the investment, and our lifestyle, and thirdly, basically the political globalization.
Thank you.
So military use and these three is, I think.
Thank you. Really big question.
Sorry,
So I think what I'm going to do, because we only have 5 minutes, before I hand over to all of you for 1 minute remarks, there was a specific question to the ambassador around climate justice. So ambassador, when you do your final remark, that there's a question there. So there are two that are sort of kind of folded into one, but they're on the topic of climate justice. One is there isn't a thematic topic allocated to climate justice as such in the COP27 agenda. So what is your opinion on the available venues for that? And I think there's another question which is sort of linked to that, which is the inclusiveness of, so there's some concerns from the civil society movement about inclusiveness of their participation at COP27. So I'll put those two questions for you, Ambassador, and then also please address the questions that the participants asked and the broader sense. Shall we start with you, Ambassador, because then I can move into the meeting here. Thank you.
Sure. Regarding the question about climate justice, the questioner is correct. There is no designated item because it's not a negotiating issue, but rather it is an underlying principle and a demand by any reasonable person that justice be a guiding principle of the process. And that's why it's not just governments who are making this demand. If you go and talk to civil society organizations, talk to practitioners on the ground, they will insist that climate justice is essential as an underlying principle to govern the whole process. They make this demand not in a vacuum, because they see and realize that the global climate regime that we have constructed over the past 30 plus years is lacking in some aspects of justice and equity. And there are manifestations of that, and we don't need to get into all of them, but I just alluded earlier to the grand bargain aspect. But I can give you, particularly when it comes to the realm of climate finance, the link between climate justice as a notion and the availability. The Honorable Minister alluded to the issue of GCF and access and the pace at which funds are actually dispersed. I just personally happen to be a board member of the Green Climate Fund, and I can attest to the remarks by the Minister that there is an issue of disbursement. I'm not taking away anything from the good work that the GCF is doing in providing funds, and it was a manifestation of this grand bargain, as I alluded earlier, but there is much to be done to ensure not just the speed of disbursement, there are other related issues, not only in GCF, in the global climate finance landscape by and large. There are issues of access, obviously. There are issues of the cost of borrowing on the open market. There are issues of debt that is already incurred and is a problem in many countries, and they're asked to take on more debt. There are issues of where does the money go? If you look at the global finance landscape, you'll find it overwhelmingly going to mitigation at the expense of adaptation. Where do grants go? What type of instruments are used? All of these are issues that are out there. Anyone can research them and see that they leave a lot to be desired when it comes to the notion of fairness and justice. So that's regarding the issue of climate justice. I just want to allude real quick to the issue of loss and damage to concur with the previous speakers. It is an important issue. It came out of Glasgow with an unsatisfactory sort of atmosphere at the end. We were all there in the G77 meetings and elsewhere, and we saw the frustration of many frontline countries, vulnerable countries, and we have taken that to heart. We've held 3 ministerial level meetings throughout the year. Loss and damage was one of the main issues being discussed. Also importantly, we've held several meetings of heads of delegation exclusively to discuss loss and damage. And I can say with some cautious optimism, to use the cliche expression, that the one we held here in Cairo in September was, I think, a significant step forward, particularly with the issue of recognizing the need to have an item. Nothing is over until we adopt the agenda, but we are much more hopeful than we were, say, in Bonn with regard to that issue. Lastly, on loss and damage, again, it's a manifestation, as demonstrated by previous speakers, of the inside-outside. They've mentioned some things on the inside, which I've alluded to, the item, moving forward and discussing the Santiago network and the Glasgow dialogue issues. That's all the inside. But issues like Denmark making a contribution, and I should give credit also to Scotland, while not a standalone party, the Prime Minister of Scotland had made that announcement in Glasgow as well, but also the Global Shield, which is manifested through Germany and now the G7. These are the outside part, and we are working with others as well to put forward some ideas on loss and damage. So progress can be made, and there is reason for optimism, but it's always going to be an issue. The underlying fundamental problem is going to be financing, whether it's a facility, whether there are other mechanisms to ensure that finance is made available to countries that need it immediately. And as rightly said by one of the speakers, I need to stress that additional, we cannot recycle existing funds, be it from ODA or from adaptation or from other climate sources to loss and damage, and just say that we're doing something for loss and damage while denying other aspects. It has to be additional. We need to be creative. Last point on climate finance, I must insist, we hear billions to trillions all of the time. Investment is the solution. Investment holds a lot of potential, but I am yet to see the business model for investment in loss and damage or investment in adaptation. So it's going to continue to be a challenge. Yes, investment will gravitate towards mitigation. There is profit to be made in renewables and other areas of mitigation, but we need to be cognizant of the reality that adaptation is a priority for many developing countries, and it needs to have creative ways to ensure the flow to meet the trillions of dollars of needs that all reports in science, UNEP, and other institutions are providing for us. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister, closing remarks.
Last word, no, it's of course a cautious optimism, and there are multiple countries we know hopefully will agree to include this eventually as an item to discuss. But I think while we try and achieve larger goals, the individual countries in many instances are not doing enough within their own periphery and demography and geography. You see countries where still large trucks are driven, very little public transport, massive fossil fuel consumptions. There are countries who has made tremendous progress, especially Europe. But there are a lot to be done while they dwell on things like the legal framework or loss and damage and and all that. But I think we have also reached to a point. I think we're struggling to raise 100 billion, but I think while we dwell on loss and damage, I think world needs to aim for even a higher fund in the tune of I can just throw a number, let's say $300 billion instead of just 100 billion, because in last 13 years, further losses were made, and countries got into fresh trouble. I can give you examples, hundreds of them in Bangladesh. So meanwhile, we can probably look for increase, and there are businesses to be made. And we have seen Elon Musk coming up with electric truck in a country where electric vehicle is still yet to be introduced.
Yeah.
They have probably introduced some. So yeah, that's it from my side.
Tim and Anna?
As we're over time and I've got a 10 o'clock meeting I have to run away with, I'll be really brief. I think we do need a global change in the way that we view the way we live on this planet, and that requires root and branch changes in investment architecture, in lifestyles, in energy, in food, in travel, in international air, etc., etc. And my hope is that it's the youth that will really drive that, because I think, certainly in a country like this where the elderly people, the older people, the ones who are worried about their pension, wants to keep everything status quo, are really quite anti large-scale change. The youngsters are the ones that give me hope. So congratulations to the teacher for coming along. Anytime you want me to come and give a talk in school, I'll come and give a talk in school, because I think it's really important.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, I'll be super brief, and I just wanted to pick up on one of your questions. It was about if we're focusing on the right things, and I would just like to concur with what the ambassador said earlier, that it's not probably possible to prioritize, because we need to prioritize everything: mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, reforming the global economy.
All right. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Minister. Thank you both. And thank you for joining.